Good morning. The U.S. Mexico Foundation and the American Enterprise Institute welcome you to this webinar on where Mexico is today in the midst of the COVID crisis and economic recession, and where important relationship is headed under President López Obrador and President Trump. I was wrong when I predicted 4 years ago that these two men would not be, shall we say, natural friends. It is clear from their meeting last week that they have managed each other rather well. However, at the risk of being wrong again, I'm concerned that the meeting in Washington masked a deeper crisis happening in both of our countries and for our economic relationship. Mexico's economy was slipping into a recession even before AMLO took office, and even before the global COVID crisis made it even worse. At a time when companies and investors should be thinking about bold moves to jumpstart the North American supply chain, many doubt whether Mexico is a good bet. A series of arbitrary decisions by AMLO have undermined investor confidence. For all the triumphal rhetoric, the USMCA agreement is scarcely sufficient to overcome deep-seated doubts about the Mexican economy. And many are concerned by the lack of strategy for responding to the ruthless narco-traffickers who threaten our two countries. My colleague, Enrique Perret, will open our discussion. Enrique is the director of the U.S. Mexico Foundation. He came to that organization in 2018 from ProMexico, and he has served elsewhere in the Mexican government promoting competitiveness. He has a degree from the Tec de Monterrey in international commerce, has a master's degree in economics and government, and has studied at Harvard, Wharton, and SMU. Let's turn the floor over to him. Enrique.
Thank you, Roger, and good morning to everyone. I'm Enrique Perret. I'm the Executive Director for the U.S. Mexico Foundation based here in Washington. And I have the honor to present our three guest panelists. And I'm going to start the first round of questions for them. It's going to be very simple. You will have 3 to 4 minutes to answer the question, and then we'll go to a second round. I'll first introduce Valeria Moy. Valeria, welcome. Valeria is the director of IMCO, the Instituto Mexicano para la Competitividad, the Competitiveness Center in Mexico. That is a think tank, one of the most prestigious think tanks in Mexico. Valeria also worked for Mexico Como Vamos, another think tank in Mexico. She has been working in the past at the National Banking and Securities Commission. She's a professor at ITAM. She also worked as a researcher for Harvard Business School. Valeria Moy is a weekly columnist at Milenio regarding economic matters and frequently participate as an economic analyst on TV, radio, and print publications. I'll move to Antonio Ortiz Mena, our second panelist. Antonio is a senior vice president for Albright Stonebridge, based here in Washington, D.C., where he provides a strategic counsel and assistance to clients across America. Prior to Albright Stonebridge, Dr. Antonio Ortiz Mena served for over 8 years as the head of economic affairs at the Embassy of Mexico here in Washington, D.C. Antonio is also a professor at CIDE in Georgetown here in Washington and back in Mexico City. Our last panelist, Bernardo González Rosas. Bernardo serves today as the president of AMAFORE, the Mexican Association of Pension Funds, since January 2019. Prior to AMAFORE, he served as financial sector specialist at the World Bank and senior advisor for the Financial Integrity Network. In 2018, he served as the chairman of the National Banking and Securities Commission, the CNBV, in Mexico. And throughout his career, he has also been appointed chairman of the board of 6 development banks in Mexico. Mr. Gonzalez was the responsible for the drafting and approval of the FinTech law in the Congress 2 years ago, and he was the chief technical negotiator for the financial services chapter for the USMCA. the agreement who was just implemented by the three countries. So I'm going to start with you, Valeria. And it's not a question, it's more a comment from your part. The most recent data on the economy of Mexico: employment, unemployment, investment, private investment, public investment. I know you work this data a lot. You talk about this data a lot on the media, on TV, on radio, and give us this overview of the status of the economy right now in Mexico, please.
Sure. Thank you, Enrique. Thank you all for inviting me here. Well, the economic data in Mexico, as pretty much all over in the world, has been really bad for the past few months. Even for the first quarter, were terrible numbers, even though the COVID crisis just started to hit in Mexico at the end of March. So last year, as Roger was mentioning, the country was slipping into a recession. And it was funny enough that we were discussing if it qualified as a recession. So you saw, big shot economists say, well, it's not a recession because it's not as hard, it's not so deep, because the economy decreased or had a negative growth rate of minus 0.3%. So the discussion at the end of 2019 was if it qualified as a recession or not. For me, it was really surprising that we were stuck in that discussion. It's like, it doesn't really matter. We are producing less than what we were producing the previous year. So we might go into the details of what a recession is, but it's pointless at some point in time. All the other numbers at the end of 2019 were terrible. The investment decreased 5.1%. So what maintained the GDP as not to decrease more was actually exports. Export grew last year, and exports grew mainly because the dynamics of trade in the United States were still doing okay. They weren't as fast or as dynamic as had been the previous years, but actually they were pretty good. Actually, the trade conflict between the United States and China helped Mexico in a sense that we became the first trade partner of the US, and we stayed there for quite a few months. But then the COVID-19 crisis hit Mexico. It started to hit the numbers in March. In January, February, we had so numbers. They weren't either very important in an optimistic way, and they weren't very low in a pessimistic way. We had, consumption increased just barely, investment decreased actually, but they weren't these huge decreases that we started seeing in March. The COVID started to hit Mexico in March, as I mentioned, and actually it was the second part of the month. So the numbers that we have that are usually related to the first quarter, they don't contain the full effect of COVID. The second quarter is going to be much more difficult for the country. The last number we had of GDP is that Mexico decreased 2.2% the first quarter compared to the first quarter of last year. But there are some other numbers that worry me much more than GDP. The first one is investment. Investment decreased during April around 30%, private investment and public investment. As a whole, the decrease was about 30% if we compare April 2020 versus April 2019. We have never seen those numbers. And of course, those numbers can be really attributed to COVID-19. So maybe we have to separate, but since we were in this decreasing trend, it's very difficult to separate the impact. So investment is doing really bad, really awful. For the first time in 17 years, investment during the last quarter was below 20%. As a developing country, what we expect or what we should have is investment to represent around 24, 25% of GDP. That number is what we aim to get at some point in time. And when I headed Mexico Como Vamos, that was one of our goals, that Mexico reached that 24, 25%. And we were actually around 22, 23, so we weren't doing that bad in investment. Most of that investment was private investment, around around 19% was due to private investment, and the rest was public investment. Public investment, which is another of my main concerns, has been decreasing seriously for the past 5, 4, 3 seconds. I mean, all those years in public investment is decreasing and decreasing and decreasing. When this administration came into power, they promised, as everybody does, that public investment would increase up to 5 points of GDP. There were around 3%, 3 points of GDP, and they would increase that percentage to 5 points of GDP. Of course, those were only words. It hasn't translated into reality. Nowadays, public investment is even below 3%, just a little bit below 3%, and we are seeing continuous decrease in that number. Employment, moving to employment. Employment has been, of course, seriously hit with the COVID crisis. We have lost in the 4 months that we can relate to the pandemic, 1,113,000 jobs, formal jobs. Please remember that in Mexico, the job market is completely separated. We have two markets we can call the dual market. We have the formal sector that is around 44% of the total occupied population. And then we have the informal sector that is not registered with the Social Security Institute, and that accrues for around 56%. So when we talk about losing more than 1 million jobs, we're talking about the formal jobs. There are some other numbers that are very interesting regarding the job market. The last one came from the INEGI. INEGI is conducting telephone surveys because they can't do person real life interviews. And the last survey regarding employment gave us a very tough number. 20 million people have lost their full-time jobs. Some of those 20 million people have been able to get some kind of job, for partial or informal, or they can work a couple of hours. So they're managing to get a little bit of income. We don't know what kind of jobs they're doing, but they have been able to deal with it in a way. But 12.5 million people have not been able to even search for a job. So what we are seeing is that the unemployment rate that you were mentioning, Enrique, hasn't increased that much because people are not even looking for a job. And to be unemployed, you have to be looking for a job. So these people, 12.5 million people, they are not looking for a job. They just moved to the unoccupied or to the non-economically active population. So we have a very big problem, a very big situation in the employment market, in the job market, and we haven't even been able to address that. The public administration, the government hasn't done basically anything to try to suppress this crisis or to try to contain this employment crisis. So basically, if you lose your job, you lose your job, and you have to be able to look out for yourself. So those are the big numbers. I won't talk more to give the other participants some time, and maybe we can come back to those numbers later.
Thank you, Valeria, for the overview. And I'll stay with investment. Bernardo, the pension system, the pension funds has been a key player on the last 20 years of development of the country. Infrastructure, energy, seed and venture funds. And what's the scenario for the pension funds right now? I mean, we're seeing the investment decreasing, but capital is there, savings are there. And how the pension system is seeing this scenario, Bernardo?
Thank you, Enrique, and thank you all for inviting me to participate in this panel. Well, I would say, Enrique, that as Valeria was saying, we see that even though Mexico's economy began a slowdown since the last quarter of 18, there is a severe deterioration of economic activity as a result of COVID-19. Some estimates are that our GDP is going to fall as much as 10% during this year. I think that the future will largely depend on our capacity to mitigate the negative impact of the pandemic. on economic activity. In this scenario, I think that the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement will play a prominent but not absolute role in Mexico's economic recovery. In regards to the pension system that you were mentioning, I would say that this was one of the most important and transforming reforms in our country in the last 20 years. It was the 97 pension reform that accomplished two fundamental things. One, it strengthened the workers' property rights over its pension. And as Mexico moved from a pay-as-you-go system to a defined benefit, a pay-as-you-go system with defined benefits to one of individual accounts with defined contribution. And the other one is to turn, this gave us fiscal sustainability to the system, and also it helped to develop a very profound financial system, which is right now quite sound compared to what we had in '95. It has been, in a lot of cases, one of the solutions to economic problems in the country instead of the cause of a problem like it happened in '95. The Afore system thus has played a key role in Mexico's development. Right now, the savings of the workers amount to almost 17% of GDP. If you compare this number to all the credit given by the banks in Mexico, the 51 banks in Mexico, they have a balance of 22% of GDP. So in these last 23 years of our system, workers have accumulated almost the same amount of money that banks have lent, or the balance of the banking system in Mexico this year. So it is really impressive from that point of view. And it has also helped to create a middle class in Mexico. And let me give you a number to sustain this this sentence that I'm saying, is that for 3 families out of 10 in Mexico, the pension fund, the Afore fund, is their first and most important asset. So as you can imagine, this is very relevant for a system that was created only in '97. And on the other hand, for another 50% of the population, of the families in Mexico, the Afore account represents the second asset, the second most important asset. These are numbers from the National Statistics Institute in Mexico, and it really reflects the importance of the system. However, it also shows, because when you see what are the balances of these accounts in time, the balance on average is about 17,000 pesos, or around, I don't know, $3,000, which it means that we are a poor country. We don't have really valuable assets in our country. However, this is the first one for 30% of the families, or the second one for another 50%. So it has also been a door for financial inclusion. I would say that the most important instrument for financial inclusion, because you have 67 million workers, or million people in Mexico with an individual account. And this is relevant because, as Valeria said, we have of our economic active population, almost 60% are informal. So when you see that 67 million people have an account, it's relevant, because it means that they sometime or in some point in time, they used to work in the formal sector and they opened this account. So finally, I think it has created competition among retirement fund managers, and also they have been more developing expertise in managing the assets of the workers along these 23 years, which is also real good. presently, there is a debate in Mexico about the retirement system. Sure, we need to make reforms more than to the afores. I would say that to the laws that right now require the mandatory savings to be around 6.5% of the worker's income. And this is really low compared to what other countries are mandatory saving for retirement, which is around 15%. So we are in the lowest part of the curve with all the countries that have a system like ours, and we need to do something. The other section that is not really useful because it's a requirement in our system to have 24 years of labor in the formal sector. And as you can imagine, this is very hard to achieve for a worker. The expectation is that only 30% of workers will get to that number of formal weeks worked or years worked in the system. And we need also to change that. Well, in regards to what we've achieved in terms of investment, I would say that of every 4 pesos that we invest in infrastructure in Mexico, 1 peso comes from the money of the workers, of the afores. So it's a very important institutional investor, the most important institutional investor in Mexico, and also the second most important financial institution. However, we need to make those changes to the retirement system in order to make sure that people can have a decent pension at the end of their working life. And right now we have a debate. We are hoping that in the middle of this economic and sanitary crisis, we can have really a reform that builds upon what we built along these 23 years, and that will allow Mexico to continue to invest in infrastructure development, in creating jobs. This sector can be very important to achieve those goals of investment that the country required for the long-term growth. Going back quickly to the USMCA, I would say that it also grants us the possibility of having a long-term vision that protects private investment, that stimulates international commerce, and that keeps linking the development of Mexico to the growth in the US and Canada, which have very good expectations for the near future. So I think that's a definite asset, but we need to also strengthen our laws and the fulfillment of those laws. Thank you, Enrique.
Thank you, Bernardo. Thank you, Bernardo. And I will move to Antonio. Antonio, Valeria mentioned that the government it's basically doing nothing. That's what she said. And I will move to small and medium businesses in Mexico that are essential and key part of the economy in Mexico. Millions of small shops and medium-sized businesses in Mexico. How's the scenario for them? Some of them have the pension fund to use as a credit line to survive, but what's the status on that point?
Enrique, thank you, and good to be here with Valeria, Bernardo, Roger, and you. I would divide this in terms of what's happening in Mexico and what, if anything, the USMCA can do in terms of small and medium enterprises. In terms of what's happening in Mexico, the situation is frankly pretty dire, right? Not only will GDP decrease by 2 digits, investment is slow. That means that the recovery will be slow. Again, going back to the way Valeria opened, saying, did we have a recession last year or not? Well, basically we grew 0. Who cares about the definition? Same thing happens with debates over the recovery. Will it be a V? Will it be a V shape? Or will it be a square root shape, as BBVA says, or will it be an L? Who knows? It will be probably pretty slow, okay? So both 2020 and 2021 will be, at a minimum, very difficult years for SMEs in Mexico. There was very little countercyclical fiscal support or any support in Mexico. So a lot of SMEs will die, and it is very difficult for them to be reborn in such a dire situation. So I am pretty concerned about the domestic situation for small and medium enterprises in Mexico. Now, I'll try to be optimistic regarding USMCA. It has a chapter on small and medium enterprises that the NAFTA did not have. And what does that chapter do? It creates a working group whereby the three governments are supposed to get together with the private sector. This is important. It's not only a government-to-government discussion to see how SMEs can benefit from the new trade agreement. And they're supposed to provide opportunities for minority groups, for indigenous groups, for women. So I think it's important for all those companies that are interested to contact their own governments to see how they can work together to make the potential about SME impacts a reality. So I would say that's a positive outlook. Beyond the USMCA, what we've seen in terms of our clients is that there is a push to relocalize supply chains, both because of the US-China trade clash and because of the weakness of the WTO. So companies are trying to reduce their risk, to mitigate their risk by relocalizing production. That means that there is a possibility for some SMEs to be part of the supply chain of the large multinationals. So I think this makes sense from an international trade perspective. It's pretty rough out there, right? It's better to stay in the neighborhood, but also, and perhaps even more importantly, because of environmental and social governance, ESG, we have seen pressure from investors, for example, from BlackRock, that said you really have to change the way you behave in terms of environmental impact and social impact, or we will no longer invest in those companies. Just this week, I believe that they issued a sort of quote unquote friendly warning to 50 companies. So it's not idle talk, right? And other companies are, if I can use this expression, in the watch list. So separately from the chaos in international trade, I would say pressure from investors and from social groups are compelling large multinationals to be more cognizant of their environmental and social impact. And I think one way to do this would be to work much more closely with SMEs. And lastly, and I want to keep this short because I want to start more of a conversation and a debate. I've tried to pitch this idea. So far, I don't think people have bought it, but I think we're in a new era of import substitution. Import substitution under an open economy, or import substitution under a theoretically open economy, but where trade barriers can be enacted through national security excuses or through non-tariff barriers over food, health, and safety, or regulations, you name it. And I do believe we're back in an era of import substitution, right? You need to produce locally, not only to reduce costs, but to be acceptable to a number of political and social groups, and to address with criticisms about the quote unquote excesses of capitalism and excesses of globalization. So I think we're seeing more long-term trends to relocalize production and to working with SMEs that's separate from the COVID drama and even separate from the weakness of the WTO. I see these as more long-term trends. Whether this will remain or whether this is feasible, who knows? But I would posit the idea that we're entering a new phase of import substitution.
Thank you, Antonio. Roger, your round of questions. I think you're on mute.
I'm muted. I'm unmuted now. Thank you. Appreciate you all being with us today. Valeria, let's start with you. You made reference to public investment in the economy being woefully low or of concern. This is a matter that's important to U.S. companies that invest there, that have supply chains deeply integrated with Mexican collaborators, with partners. And they're concerned whether that supply chain is going to be there to be adequate partners as these economies start to recover after the COVID crisis is brought under some control. You see Chile, Peru, Brazil have spent between 6 and 12% in stimulus packages. I'm a conservative, former Republican, who's always advocated fiscal restraint. We're now at 14%, the US, and we're talking about another $1 trillion that would push it closer to 20% of GDP in terms of stimulus packages. Certainly in this kind of crisis, this is precisely when stimulus would be called for, would be justified to sustain the economy. Please give us your thoughts. Are you concerned that President López Obrador's being a fiscal hawk or concerned about deficits is something that may be a virtue in other times, but maybe a serious problem for Mexico today?
Well, just to put some context into your question, you were mentioning that the United States is spending around, I don't know, 13% of GDP in fiscal stimulus, and then we can see Germany that is spending around 30% of GDP in fiscal stimulus. What Mexico is spending in fiscal stimulus is 0.4% of GDP, and I'm being very, very generous considering this, because I'm considering a social program transfer that was already budgeted for the end of this year, that was advanced. So that shouldn't be included, but since I want to be, see the glass half full, I include that. Otherwise, it would be just 0.2%. So there is one thing about being conservative and being irresponsible, I think, and that's a difference. And that's a difference. I'm a fiscal. I love that being fiscally responsible. I don't like deficits. I don't like superavits as well. It's just we have to be. I love a balanced budget. But then again, you don't have to consider that as evil or good just per se. That has to be used when it needs to be used. And what we are doing in Mexico right now is we're not apparently incurring in more debt. That's the way the president sees things and the way he sees fiscal balance. He's very conservative in that regard. He doesn't like debt, but the thing that worries me is that he doesn't like debt by itself. He gives debt this characteristic of being bad just for being debt. Which I don't agree with. I think that debt should be used when you need it and to foster some of the projects or some of the needs that your country have. What we are doing right now is we are not apparently incurring in more debt, but since our GDP is going to decrease so badly, the ratio that GDP is going to increase. So that's going to actually play against his own objectives of not increasing the ratio that GDP, because our GDP is going to decrease so badly that in GDP is going to increase. So I think we are doing a poor policy there. And the thing that worries me the most is not only that we are not incurring in debt, because that might be debatable. The thing that worries me is that we're going to spend a lot of money, a lot of resources, of public resources, that they are always scarce, as we all know, in several projects that have no public, how do you say it? Rendimiento, benefit. Public benefit, yeah. So return, that was the word I was looking for, sorry. That they don't have any public return. So we're going to spend a lot of money in a refinery that we're going to build actually in a green area, a very complicated area to build a refinery. We're going to crush the mangrove. It's going to be very complicated to build it there, but we are going to build it there because it's the present state where he was born and he wants the refinery there. So we're going to build that. We are going to build a train in the Maya area, in the Peninsula de Yucatan, which it might be nice. It might be a fun train. It might be good to attract tourism, but it has no public return at all, not financially, not economic, not social returns, and we're going to destroy the jungle while we build it. And we're going to build a new airport, and this is really funny and it's really hard to say. We're going to build a new airport that doesn't add any single flight to the current capacity. So the question is why we're going to build it, and I don't have an answer for that. So we're going to separate the current capacity. Instead of having one airport, we're going to have two airports, and that capacity is going to be split in two airports. The reason behind that, I think it's just a whim, a personal whim of the current administration. So it's not the debt issue, it's not the lack of support. Is the thing that worries me is that we are spending a lot of money in projects that have no social return, no economic return whatsoever. And we are not using those resources, those monies to help deal with the current situation. So the current situation is not being attended, is not being supported. Workers are not being supported. SMEs are not being supported. Of course, big firms aren't being supported as well, but we are very stubborn on building the refinery, on building the airport, and on building the Maya train. That's a thing that is very contradictory for me. It's like, if we don't have money, we don't have money. You know, if we make the decision of not supporting employment or not supporting the firms because we have no money, then it might be understandable to say we don't have any money. We can't do it. I mean, if we want to be fiscally responsible, and that might be considered, you know, a higher objective. Let's stick to that. So we are being fiscally responsible, but we are spending in so many projects that have no social returns, and that's the thing that sounds very contradictory. So that's what worries me about the public finances at this point in time.
Understandable. That's a very fair critique. I want to remind the audience that the questions will be welcome if you want to send them by Twitter to hashtag U.S. Mexico Future, and we'll field those questions. Valeria, you referred to this series of arbitrary decisions by President López Obrador. If I can use that word, I'm not assigning that word to you, but certainly U.S. partners, and we are very close partners and have been for decades. They see these things too. They see the cancellation of the Mexico City airport that in favor of this other white elephant airport. They see arbitrary decisions vis-a-vis Constellation Brands, huge investment bottler that would have employed 2,000 people in Baja California. They see decisions in the energy sector, and let's go to energy for Antonio. So the reforms that President Peña Nieto launched, and before him some other efforts made, they made some halting progress. I tend to be not very generous about this, but made some halting progress toward opening up that sector to private and foreign investment. The nationalist and statist and even worse bureaucratic practices actually cheat the Mexican people of cheap energy and, more importantly, squandered source of revenue for the state. What would AMLO have to do differently to realize that energy sector's real potential? What would he have to do differently to send a signal that sector was really open for business? And the simple word "everything differently" does not work. We need an explanation.
Okay, let me take one step back, Roger. And I think the key word here is stability. Stability in terms of the rules governing investment, both national and foreign investment. So way back when we were negotiating NAFTA, the idea was to provide stable rules. Companies could decide whether or not they wanted to play with those rules, but those were the rules. Same thing with USMCA. The basic premise is that it will provide a stable environment for trade and investment, okay? And I think that we have a problem with that, because in the case of energy, the government is trying to change the rules, right? Through regulations, through legal amendments, and that provides a lot of instability. And the problem is that in some instances, the government is doing this after the investment has already been executed. That was the case with the debate with the pipeline companies, Canadian, U.S. and Mexican, all of NAFTA, right? Great, all three nationals are being affected after they've already built the gas pipeline infrastructure, because the government decided that the contracts were unfair. The word in Spanish were leoninos, and they define what's fair and unfair, what's leoninos, and they forced a renegotiation, okay? And this affects not only energy companies, but all companies investing in fixed assets. How am I going to invest if the government, after the investment, will want to change the rules? For me, that is the biggest issue. That is the biggest concern. How can that be resolved? By, to use a US legal term, ceasing and desisting this type of behavior, and by correcting the wrongs that was done in a number of areas that you mentioned, okay? That's, for me, that's the biggest, that's the general concern, and I don't think that the USMCA can do this. Mind you, the protection for foreign investment that the USM provides, especially for manufacturing, is much lower than the NAFTA protection. That's USMCA Chapter 14 is weaker than NAFTA Chapter 11. And this affects specifically US companies, because Canadian companies can use investor protections that are provided for under the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And European companies can use the agreements between the EU or EFTA, the European Free Trade Association, and Mexico. So the US companies are at a particular disadvantage with the USMCA. And I think that the Mexican government, if it wants to attract investment and reach the 25% needed to grow at acceptable rates to create jobs, it will need to change course in general. Now, let me turn briefly to energy. I think some folks believe that the sort of market adverse decisions on both uncertainty on hydrocarbons, it's not only renewables, but also renewables, affects companies in the energy sector. I would say this is not right. Again, it sends a troubling signal to companies across all industries. And secondly, it also affects companies that are consumers of energy, intensive consumers of energy, right? Not only producers, but also consumers. So it's a big problem. It's a huge problem, okay? It's not an energy problem. What can the government do? It can say, okay, maybe I did not like the rules that existed before, and henceforth, I will change the rules, but I will do them respecting the independence of regulatory bodies, which they have not. I will avoid surprises, and I will try to engage in constructive discussions with energy companies to see how they can have a positive impact on employment, on wages, on the environment, etc. So there's a possibility to do that. But so far, I think that this is a lose-lose situation. I don't think in the end, Pemex will be better off through these policies. It can be a black hole through which we're channeling resources. Valeria mentioned the refinery. The refinery is part of the black hole. A lot of other funding is also going to supporting Pemex beyond that refinery. I don't think it'll help CFE. I don't think it'll help employment. I wouldn't think it will help the environment or renewal. So it really is a lose-lose proposition. And I won't make a judgment calls in terms of predictions. Do I think this will change? I will say that sooner or later, the reality will dawn. And I hope it's sooner rather than later, because this is really a lose-lose proposition, no matter where you look at it, Roger.
Well, a dramatic, but I think valid critique. Bernardo, let me ask you perhaps the toughest question of all. Does AMLO have a strategy? We've all described various concerns. Does he have a strategy on any of these things? We've watched him for a long time A lot of people will say we got exactly what we should have expected when he was elected, but he was overwhelmingly elected. What's the strategy? Is he satisfying people with the strategy, people that voted for him?
Thank you, Roger, and it definitely is the toughest question. Thank you. No, I would say that President López Obrador has pursued and done everything he promised before being elected he was going to do. Cancel the airport, strengthen Pemex, strengthen CFE. I think we have to be very clear. We have to understand that the goal of the administration is to have strong energy companies, state energy companies. Of course, this is a conflicting objective with the energy reform that we have the previous administration. Of course, there are contracts. They are protected by our laws and by our judicial system, which has given some good results to some of the legal demands that there have been requested by these companies. I think we have to understand that this administration will last only 6 years, that we have the chance, if we don't like it, to change it after 6 years, that we have to coexist with this vision of public policies. The majority of Mexico decided to go that way. And I think his popularity is still high among the people that voted for him. It's decreasing, but it's high. And the other part is that we also have to understand that we have a treaty like the USMCA, and it's great news that this administration has really backed up that treaty, because it gives us, as I was saying at the beginning of my intervention, a framework for the long term, and a framework of free commerce, of free markets, of competition. And this is the view of an administration that will change. And even though another candidate from the president's party win the next election, it's not the same. It's not the same vision. It's not the same ideology. So we have to learn how to coexist with this. Of course, it scares private investment. It has had very negative and profound effects in our economy and in the uncertainty created by some of the public policies that we're seeing. In the case of the pension system, we've seen how some legislators have presented initiatives in Congress to make use of the savings of the workers by the government, and so that the government will manage all those funds, all those 4 billion pesos or $2 trillion for investing in projects like Valeria described. Right now we have, because the president has not, I think, so strong feelings regarding the pension system, he has some ideas, but he has been very open to strengthen the system that we have. We've been working with the private sector, the government, in order to find ways to make a reform to the system and not destroy what we built during these 23 years. We need to learn how to work with these new ways of thinking and try to make the best for Mexico. Really, I think we have a strong democracy, and I really believe in those institutions. And if we don't like a government program, we can always decide to change. The thing is that popularity is still high, and we'll see what happens next, Roger. But at least I believe that things like our judicial system, strong commitment to USMCA and other international treaties are important to maintain the course of our country.
Let me just ask Valeria. Bernardo referred to democracy, strong democratic institutions. You know, people were expecting that the mid-year congressional elections would be an opportunity for AMLO, if anything, to add to his advantages. Is there a possibility that the Mexican people that there's enough of a articulated opposition in the country among the other political parties that they will be able to push back and sort of level the playing field a little bit in terms of congressional elections that will be coming up in a year and a half?
Well, that's a very difficult question to ask, and it's more difficult to answer it. What I'm seeing right now in terms of opposition is that the opposition is really segmented, is really fragmented. Maybe we have local leaders, local people that might be of a lot of interest regionally, not as a national level, but since the midterm elections are more regional related, might be the strategy that works. But what I'm seeing that kind of worries me, because I don't agree with it, but let's be very clear, I'm not a political analyst nor anything of the sort. What I see is that people are trying to make a huge opposing block, you know, to try to have all the other parties, PRI, PAN, MC, all the other big and smaller political parties to unite and to build a coalition in order to be as strong as Morena is right now. So maybe the idea is, as Bernardo was saying, the president still has a lot of popularity. So maybe what they're thinking is they're trying to create an opposing bloc that can fight back and oppose the forces that Morena has. I don't think that's a very good idea because Morena built through the years. And we have to be very clear on that. The current president did campaigning for almost 18 years, and he was basically knocking every door in the country for a long time and trying to build a coalition out of the blue. So yeah, Morena did a coalition. You have far left, far right, and it's not a political party. It's more a movement than a political party. And there you have lots of mixtures. But it kind of worked because the now president, did a lot of campaigning, and it was almost a personal issue. If we try, or if the opposition tries to make something similar, I don't think it can work, but maybe they think they can. And that's what I'm seeing right now. They're trying to move towards forming a bloc in order to deal with the Morena strength in the next year. Maybe it's too soon, but that's what I'm seeing. They are trying to form a political bloc, and I don't think a political united force. I don't think that can work, but maybe I'm completely wrong.
Well, we will see. We will see. There's a long way to that, obviously, and we're even a long way to our election here in the United States. I suppose anything could happen. Let me just ask the other two panelists, Antonio and Bernardo, to weigh in on. There's going to be one thing when we talk about nearshoring, decoupling from China. I think it makes abundant good sense, but then again, I'm an Americanist, and I prefer us aligning with Latin America and the Caribbean and Canada. It just makes a heck of a lot of sense. But you know, if there's one thing, USMCA given, okay, if there's one or two things that the private sector could do to advance this kind of vision, I think our national leaders, political leaders, are so preoccupied with the COVID crisis, and for good reason. I think this is a time when private sector people should be sitting in their home offices thinking about how do they jumpstart this vision in the Western Hemisphere, this economic integration. Or Antonio, we'll start with you. What are your thoughts?
Roger, well, just very briefly on the elections, in addition to legislative elections, 15 governorships are up for election. So it's not only legislative, but the state executives. And I think that's something to look out for. That's half of the country's governors. And maybe that will change the cause of power shift. Who knows? I just throw it out there. What will happen? I have no idea. Okay. Right. Now, let me turn to what can companies do? My sense is that they should really take ESG seriously and make it an integral part, a holistic part of their production process, not some add-on like, I'll, donate to a school, or I'll publish a book on the Mexican Caribbean with beautiful pictures and all that. I'm sort of being sarcastic, but that was the way it was done before. Why do I say this? First, because there are huge political and social pressures in Mexico to do things in a different way. Are you a good corporate citizen? Are you really paying your taxes or not? How about your wages? How about your relation with unions? How about the environmental impact? How about, minorities, etc.? So that's in terms of just domestic pressure. But in terms of the USMCA, I would say that it really is a new type of agreement. In some ways, I think it backtracks. I'm more of a liberal than the USMCA is, more market-led, free trade, etc. But let's put that aside. In terms of the progressive agenda, there are a lot of things in the USMCA that can be used. I mentioned the SME component and the gender component that very few people see there. There's a gender component in the USMCA. There's an indigenous groups component, and then there's a North American competitiveness chapter that has barely been mentioned. So I think that through ESG, companies can really try to reduce risk and to improve things. So do good and do well. Otherwise, I think they'll be all over the place. So it has to be ESG completely aligned with what they're doing, not an add-on. That's what I would do, Roger.
Great. Bernardo, your thoughts? I think you're still muted, sir.
I'm sorry. I would say that it sells by itself. I mean, the economic returns of a regional integration for commerce instead of China, it makes sense. It makes sense regionally, economically, from a lot of point of views. I would say that the private sector should focus on developing or trying to invest in sectors that are not controversial for Mexico's government. I think there are a lot. We've seen that they have strong feelings with the energy sector, but we have many more. And we could try to push and try to attract investment through USMCA to all those other industries. Again, and also I think the US government has had a very relevant impact on the public policies in Mexico. And I think it would be great if the private sector, both in Mexico and the US, could use that relationship and that leverage in order to keep or continue to strengthen the rule of law in Mexico, public safety for our citizens and, of course, international investors, and improving working conditions in Mexico. If we really, if the private sector focused, I think, in those issues, I think we can have a successful regional integration and make the USMCA a true success and have a very prosperous region. Probably I'm on the positive side of how I see things, of how things can be analyzed, but I really see there are a lot of possibilities right now.
Right. Well, I think we all have to remain optimistic because they really don't have any other choice. It's just an important partnership, and we have to make it work. Great resources, great people on both sides of the border. I want to thank you on behalf of AEI for your participation. I want to thank our audience members. Actually, we did have a couple of questions at the end that I should have identified as questions from the audience. Enrique, I want to thank you also for your participation. I'll toss it to you for a final word or two. And also before I go, Andrés Martinez Fernandez for your great work here at AEI in putting this together. Enrique.
Thank you, Roger. I truly believe that the relationship between Mexico and the U.S. it's super important for both countries. We're seeing a region at the border with 10 states working on COVID for sure, but working also on infrastructure, working on industries like the aerospace, the automotive industry, electronics. I mean, many industries that are thriving in Mexico, thriving in US, and obviously in Canada. So we need to think more as a region. North America, in the US, obviously, most of you think on Mexico as part of Latin America, and I think that ship we need to change, as seeing Mexico more as a North American region, and the possibilities are huge. Thank you, Roger and AI, to host this event. I think, I mean, if all the listeners follow Antonio, Valeria, and Bernardo on social media, they will learn more about Mexico. And the U.S. Mexico Foundation, well, is here to stay to help the interaction between the U.S. and Mexico. Thank you, Roger, and thank you, Andres, again.
Great, thank you. We're adjourned. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
Oh,
Goodbye.
bye.